basically consider European engagement and especially German engagement in South Africa.
Right.
Do you consider, is it something positive, as consistent, as something that is looked up to, or what is your perception about that?
Well, in my own experience as the public protector in the last 6 years, the German engagement with institutions in South Africa has been positive and impactful. There's been support given to my office around good governance, including a good governance conference, but more importantly, the German government provided support for the establishment of the African Ombudsman Research Center in Durban, and without that assistance we would not have been able to do it. It was partly support in terms of technical support to procure skills, but the value add was also the project management support. We're now also experiencing some support from the German government relating to our electronic case management system. Again, it wasn't just the technical support that we've been given, it's been also support in terms of project management and project conception. I also seem to be aware that the support is also extended to the broader government of South Africa, including the Treasury.
Thank you. And how would you think could that be even improved? How could this engagement of Germany in South Africa even be improved?
Well, certainly from our side we would say that it would help if we get more support. The kind of improvement would not be so much in terms of different services. The kind of service that is currently provided is good in that they procure technical support, which is usually people from the country here, and then the project office also supports the project to make sure timelines are met and objectives are met. The improvement would be to increase the scope of support. For example, with us, we would have needed more money for the case management system, and because there wasn't an immediate amount of money available, we may have to go through a phase where there's a bit of a lull before we take off again. And the Good Governance Conference as well, eventually we didn't have adequate support. We're not complaining, we're saying we've had good support, but if the scale of support could be increased a bit. And I know that often we're not given that much support because it is assumed that South Africa is a developing country. It's not an underdeveloped country. But we saw a country with two worlds in one. And also when it comes to the level of technical know-how in terms of traveling the journey from where we are to where we want to be, some technical support would not hurt us at all.
Ms. Madonsela, and speaking now generally about South Africa, what do you think is maybe the biggest political challenge your country, South Africa, is facing at the moment?
Well, we've just turned 21 years in terms of being a constitutional democracy, and we have adopted, I think in the past year, a national development plan. The biggest challenge is really walking the talk. We have good intentions, but we've never walked this journey before. So some of the things we have provisions in our constitution, some were borrowed from the German constitution in terms of the constitutional court, etc., and other constitutions, and some of them are more forward-looking than what people had known before. So when it comes to interpreting the constitution, we've hit a few snakes in the last few years, in the last 2 years, and the kind of challenge that we have now is to ensure that the courts provide clarity on certain constitutional provisions as they have always done before.
I understand. And how would you like to see, or can Germany there be of any help in overcoming this challenge?
I think where Germany can assist is, again, technical support in terms of understanding a constitutional interpretation at the level of government, because at the level of the courts, I would say that South Africa has one of the best court systems in the whole world, and institutions supporting constitutional democracy such as ours is also a groundbreaking thing. However, when it comes to government, if government does need technical support in terms of MPs being made acquainted with the Constitution in its entirety, it would help, because MPs are not lawyers, yet they are lawmakers. So some kind of accelerated development in terms of translation from an ordinary person into a lawmaker, that would be helpful. And also any platform that could be supported that facilitates dialogue between government and institutions supporting constitutional democracy would be helpful. In this regard, we had the Good Governance Conference, which was a platform where we used to have ministers, MPs, local government people, and civil society just dialoguing about the constitutional provisions that relate to governance, and what does this mean, and if it means this, what conduct is required from politicians and from ordinary people to comply with the Constitution.
Ms. Madonsela, how do you think can Germany and Europe be of support in terms of, how can Europe and especially Germany contribute to good governance and the rule of law in South Africa?
I would think that the best contribution Germany can make is the areas where it has been contributing, which is in the area of skills and knowledge, providing technical support to Treasury to make sure that the Treasury is strong enough to enforce a financial management and the compliance with the Public Finance Management Act. Support to be also provided into the governance sector, because we do have the justice sector, but the governance sector is a different sector to the justice sector. Again, technical support within government around how do you deal with these institutions that are neither courts nor executive structures. What is the best way to utilize these institutions, because they're an asset to government, they're not an enemy of government, and how does government utilize them? I would say technical support above everything else. And financing of the NGO sector to the extent possible. That I believe that a lot of financing at the moment is provided to the NGO sector that deals primarily with welfare services, HIV, health, etc. That's great. But in terms of strengthening constitutional democracy, I think those that deal with corruption, that deal with governance, and that deal with broadly issues of democracy and human rights also need to be financed. In that way, we would be promoting stability, because I normally believe that an engaged citizenry is not a dangerous citizenry, because when they are engaged, they ask the right questions to the right people, then they don't feel the need to go to the street and protest, which is disruptive and could be dangerous.
And maybe adding on to that, to what degree would you think South Africa would rather feel an engagement of Germany in the country as like an improper interference?
At the moment, there's a very good relationship, as far as I know, between the German government and the South African government. Whatever help my office is getting, for example, it's part of a broader agreement between the South African government and the German government, and the monies are received through Treasury. But it is true that you wouldn't want the German government to dictate where should South Africa be going. I think it would be a consultative process with institutions such as mine, the Human Rights Commission, the Auditor General, Treasury, and government. And I'm certain that government, in implementing the National Development Plan, it would stand to benefit from a country like Germany, which had a Marshall Plan that it had to implement. Because developing a strategy and implementing a strategy are two different things, because you need to then know what should you stop doing, what should you start doing in order to make the journey between where you are and where the strategy is taking you to.
How would you suggest shall European and German, especially development cooperation policy, deal with political regimes, governments in Africa that are seen or that may not have a big legitimation, or whose legitimation might be dubious?
Well, I can't dictate to any government about how do you deal with illegitimate regimes. I would say, as part of Agenda 2063 in the African Union and silencing the guns in Africa by 2020, the idea is not to promote regimes that disrespect the rule of law and constitutionalism. But how do you then, of course, as a European government, engage with them? Part of it is really to look at aid and say, do you give aid to government if the government itself is violating the rule of law, or do you finance the NGO sector as it happened under apartheid? Then, of course, there's a question about if foreign countries are supporting the NGO sector, is the NGO sector being abused or being agents of foreign governments? For me, I would reject that argument with contempt. Under apartheid, we were funded by foreign governments, but that did not dictate our agenda. We decided our own agenda. Of course, I would expect whoever funds you because they have an interest in the outcomes you seek. So that obviously is a given.
All right. And seeing the increased importance of African-European collaboration, especially for global issues like climate change, combating terrorism, human or drug trafficking, where would you like to see South Africa and Germany partnering on such global issues?
Well, certainly the whole idea of attacking climate change, global warming, and dealing with environmental issues and related human rights issues, I would like to see more strengthened ties between South Africa, Germany, and the entire world, because we're in the same boat, really, when it comes to the issues of climate change. It might not, some of those issues may not be immediate to us as Africa, but the reality of climate change is that it is impacting everyone, because they say clouds have no borders. Whatever we do here in South Africa has impacts for what happens in New Zealand, and what happens in New Zealand or Japan has implications for what happens here in Africa. Primarily, though, in Africa, it is about raising awareness about the issues of climate change, so that perhaps not like the West, we shouldn't start dealing with the problem when it has been exacerbated. Because we often argue that, for example, carbon emissions are not a big problem in Africa because we're not highly industrialized. But my approach would be, why not solve the problem before it gets bigger than us? And also considering that even if our own emissions are a minuscule amount in the global village, but we're contributing to a global village. So everything we can do to address environmental issues, environmental justice, it would contribute not only to our own welfare as African countries, it would be a contribution to our global home as the human race.
Thank you. And Ms. Madonsela, where would you see maybe conflicting interests between Germany, South Africa, Europe, South Africa?
I would say part of the conflicting interest might be also the issue of how do we address climate change. At the moment, South Africa is one of those countries that is really committed to green energy and to addressing the environmental challenges head on. However, if you're looking at Africa as a whole, there is often the concern around the fact that Africa's industrialization is still at a baby stage, and to be constrained with these restrictions on how much you can emit carbon to the environment might stunt our development. So that is one issue. The other area that is a potential issue is the different approaches between the AU and the EU on bad governance among member states. And my sense of it is, speaking to colleagues and then just following on the media, is that with the EU is a club, but there's also a sense of members of the club must stick to certain basic rules. Whereas with the AU, at the moment, there's still the battle around collegiality versus peer pressure to get people to do the right thing. We have a good document, Agenda 2063. We have a good document, Silencing the Guns, by 2020. But 2020 is around the corner. How do you silence the guns then? It's the issue of how do you deal with colleagues that step out of line whilst retaining collegiality. I think the EU has done a little bit better in that regard. With the African Union, there are issues around when do we pledge solidarity with the wrongdoer, and when do we tell our friend you are a wrongdoer?
Ms. Madonsela, is there anything you would like to add? Is there anything of importance I forgot to ask you, but you would like to mention?
Yes, the one thing I would like to add is that the European Union, Germany, and all friends all over the world should support the African Ombudsman institution as a whole, not just the South African Public Protector, this institution in all countries in Africa, because we have agreed with the AU, with whom we have an agreement, that this institution is one of the institutions that countries have to build in Africa as part of strengthening constitutional democracy in the continent, and that where it plays a role, we have seen a difference in terms of the strengthening of good governance, and we think it can also play a role in silencing the guns in Africa.
Thank you a lot. This was very kind.